than 2 minutes. What is important for human is the appraisal, the experience that you have, that it's unique to yourself. And when we enter a conversation, and I ask you about a subject, that's the valuable information. So we believe that in the future, we will empower a machine that will be able to laugh, to cry, and to dream. Thank you.
I'd just like to be the first person in the room of a certain age to say, I think 640,000 emotions per microsecond will be enough for any robot. I was doing the calculations. Our next speaker is Kathleen Richardson, who's going to give us some more ideas about ethics, robots, and maybe ownership of machines and property.
Thank you for that introduction. I want you to consider that in 2015, $600 billion was spent on advertising. 600 billion. The aid budget to Africa in 2015 was 135 billion. So it seems as a society we're very interested in products, property, and we're very interested in convincing people to buy products, to think about their relationships with their products, to think about how products can enhance you and make you a different kind of person, give you special kind of status. And I think what we're really entering into with these robotic narratives is a new form of consumerism, where basically people are encouraged now to have relationships with property. And if you want to really understand this kind of desire to have relationships with property, you have to understand how neoliberal capitalism works and what kind of society we live in. So when I go to artificial intelligence conferences, I don't see roboticists or scientists anymore. I see marketing executives who are trying to tell me that I can have a relationship with a machine and trying to convince me that elderly people would rather have a mechanical seal than a day trip out with their friends or you know, a community centre. So where does this all come from? Well, to understand my perspective, you have to understand it's rooted in anti-slavery. Because we live in a world, even to this day, where people have been considered as property, and they are still considered as property. And particularly women's bodies are still merchandise in this world. In places all across the United Kingdom, you can buy women's bodies as merchandise. And in the slave system, human beings were property, and all kinds of human beings were property. So they were still recognized as biological human beings, but in these societies, there were justifications developed about why you could treat some human beings as property and not others. And what's very interesting is in this analysis that I'm presenting to you, property can become like persons. So here we have corporations, corporate personhood. And what's very interesting is in the US Declaration of Independence, when it was signed, later they had to amend it to include freed slaves, the 14th Amendment. And at that point, it was corporations who said, personhood, you know, this is something we can use as property owners to advance our rights. And that's where corporate personhood comes from. So we've had this interesting back and forth. We've had people represented as property, and now we're having property represented as kind of persons, institutions, organizations represented as kind of persons. And then we move on to the robot, which I think is an extraordinary kind of manifestation of this idea of the person as property. So the kind of characterizations that you've been shown tonight about robots have nothing to do, only a little bit actually, with the original meanings of the robots that come from the 1920s play Rossum's Universal Robots. And in the play, you know, Karel Čapek, imagine it's Czechoslovakia in 1918, and he's like, he's really avant-garde, he's really cool, he's hanging out with his brother, he's like, you know, what do I call these workers in my play? And he was just going to call them, you know, a worker. And his brother said, his brother was an artist, and he said, why don't you call them robots, after the term robota, which is a word for work in Slavic, has also another meaning. So So the kind of idea, the robot, was this idea to think about what would, the kind of society that the capitalist system would really like would be a worker, right, that didn't have any subjectivity, that was just made to labor, made to work. And interestingly in the play, it's the first play ever to feature the end of humanity, and that was 1921 in Prague. So this kind of idea, this idea that workers were property and that they were owned and that their interiority, their subjectivity was not kind of important, if you like, to the class at the time, was really some of the themes that were represented in this play. And I'll tell you another interesting fact about the robot. The first robots weren't even machines. They were human beings. They were assembled on a production line, but they were human beings. And what Čapek said was that, well, what happened was other artists took the robot and they turned it into a machine. So when this play was circulated throughout Europe and throughout the world, they saw the robot character, and everyone was obsessed with machines at the time. It was called machine modernism. Everyone looked to the machine as this way to deliver this new society, whether it was communism or capitalism. And other artists turned the robot into a machine. So the first robots weren't even machines. And then we've got this new movement in society where we're saying we can have relationships with our property now, And you've got to think about the communities. They're often very vulnerable communities that these robots are being tested on. Adults with Alzheimer's, children with autism, people who are very vulnerable. And given real choices in society, would they really choose to have a robot in their lives? There's no evidence for that. And I'm sure there are surveys about, and I've read them and I've seen them, of how, when you actually put one of these entertainment robots in the presence of people, they are interested in them. And I'm interested in them. I love the idea that, that robots can dance and do wonderful things. I think it's extraordinary. But crossing a line and saying that human needs can be met by machines is something that we need to question in our society. So a good way to characterize this is the idea of the transhumanism, which I think is one of the most advanced form of property relations. So in transhumanism, at the moment, we're speculating about the idea that if you have a disability, then you can use some robotic prosthetic that might help you, might assist you in a particular way. But now let's think about the future. What if we can convince able-bodied people that they don't need their arms, or they don't need their legs, or they can have microchips implanted into their memories? All these things are remarkably profitable. And I think this kind of, transhumanism is really a marketing tool of the elite. So back to slavery, because none of this won't make any sense unless you understand slavery. So what Aristotle said when he justified slavery, he says, tools can be animate or inanimate. A slave is a living piece of property. So I want you to think about that for a minute, because I would be, well, maybe during the discussion we can find out, who here thinks human beings are instruments? So recently at a dinner with philosophers who were telling me about machine rights and how machines were going to have rights, we were at dinner and he said, yeah, people are instruments, just like a jug of water. And so I asked him, I said, well, why don't you ask the waiter over and ask him whether he's an instrument? And he didn't. So it seems like philosophers are very happy to call human beings instruments in philosophy conferences, but not in front of the instruments. So I want to talk about tools, because I want to be very clear. People are not property, persons are not property, and property are not persons. These are distinct and separate, and we need to maintain those distinctions. And I don't mind if you develop a robot and it can lift a person and it can do X, Y, and Z. But when you start using the ideas that human beings are tools and taking those ideas and using them in the development of robots, then I think there are problems there. And that's something that I write about in my own research. And I'll leave you on that note about tools.
Thank you, Kathleen, for that. I know there's some very interesting work on the origins of money coming from debt and slavery. I think it might be really interesting to look at how that will explore with robotics transforming the nature of work in the future. So our next speaker is Richie Graham, who I hope is going to be able to speak to us slightly more about how children will interact with robots in the future and how the development of society will proceed.
Right, thank you very much. I hope what I'm going to say is going to complement a lot of what's gone before, helpfully. And I'm going to bring, as a child psychiatrist, both a developmental child development perspective, but what we might also understand, following on from Tom, from a psychoanalytic model of the mind, and how we relate to objects around us. And again, following on from the last presentation, I think there's something extraordinarily interesting in the way we have intense relationships with technology as well as each other, and property in other senses. And this goes a long way back, I think even before the robots. The phrase, as I'm sure you've heard many times, Deus ex machina, the God from the machine, goes back to sort of early Greek drama, and yet the phrase is extraordinary, isn't it? The God, the solution from the machine. So in my work, where I'm thinking a lot in health about the relationship to technology from the internet as a network through to social media and use of devices, really interested in how technology lends itself to a sort of receptacle for all sorts of deep, again going back to Tom's icebergs, unconscious fantasies, desires that are buried lower down in the mind, often rooted in the earliest moments of life, where as infants our emotions were beyond our control. And it does seem to me that when we are thinking about technology, we have to understand that we're under the sway of intense drives and emotions within ourselves that actually colour our perceptions. And I think one really interesting aspect of that then is we can't ever have a completely neutral attitude to either technology or the creation, programming and perception of them. So I think we're going to see whatever else happens with the introduction of robots into our lives, all sorts of intense reactions as we see around the world in many other ways. Certainly it seems to me that there is a huge desire and fantasy for what Morozov has called solutionism, that sort of, again, God from the machine, that almost all of our current difficulties are going to be solved by robots, and that's really not to say some of the great examples shown already, particularly for vulnerable groups and people in sort of remote locations, can get some support through this. But it's been there a long time in our relationship. I was just thinking in terms of sort of art and history, whether E.T.A. Hoffman, Tales of Hoffman's, the protagonist falls in love with a mechanical doll and Coppelia, the ballet form of that, or even going back to the 50s, of course, where robots were appearing in films, Forbidden Planet, where the creature from the id sort of gave expression to the father's jealous feelings towards his daughter's life. So we certainly have this intense relationship. I suppose growing up some years ago now, I realised that a lot of my attitudes might be rooted also in representations of technology. And I thought initially that these were robots because they're technically wearables, aren't they? Where there is something, it's an Apple Watch gone now. But it had such a powerful impact and clearly represented something about the terrible war that preceded this period of human development. So I think we bring a lot to our relationship, and I'm very preoccupied that we don't become passive, whether in relation to wearables or data that we think and develop. And I do think also how we treat technology and objects, property matters. The psychoanalyst, child analyst Melanie Klein saw how children, when playing, invested a great deal of emotion and creativity in the interactions between simple figures. But those figures themselves were representations symbolically of parental figures, of siblings, of all sorts of figures in their life. And so one of the things I think we also need to think about in our attitudes isn't just, it's very interesting about machines having rights, so I think I'd be quite pro that, is that it does matter internally. It affects our cognitive, our emotional functioning, as Tom said. Similarly, children, when very small, one of the earliest desires is to control and to sort of get what you sort of desire, really, without any concern or guilt. And again, I think maturity and actually quite important cognitive developments come from that capacity to empathise, to think inside the other person, how they experience something, and that sort of opening up of a sort of mental space where we're considering the feelings and thoughts of others really brings a lot to development. And I do think, you know, there's a risk that if we can control so much more around us, we'll start to have less interest in that difficult and sometimes painful work of understanding others. So maturity definitely brings that greater capacity for concern and empathy. And I do think we have to consider what's it going to do to us developmentally, particularly younger people, if they feel they can just control in contemptuous or callous ways the objects around them. And I don't know how easy it is to break robots either. Which is, of course, one of the things one does learn from, but some of you probably have experience of that. The other thing is, I do think to get the best from robots, it is about us developing ourselves. I'm very interested in simply worked about the Microsoft Twitter bot Tay, and how quickly, if one doesn't give the right sort of experience, and how machines, I mean, we all learn through internalising what we might call introjection of working models that are templates for what we then sort of use to understand and see the world through. And I presume there are similar processes with artificial intelligence in terms of not just giving it the right data and making sure it's been cleaned up and appropriate, but actually how we act is going to have an impact, I presume, on the way machines learn about what humanity is. And so there's a real, I think, need for us to be upping our game, not just for fear of our lives, but also to actually demonstrate different ways of behaving and relating to each other. And qualities like generosity, again, I think there's scope for improvement there, as we've just heard. Just one final thing, some very good presentations about how those with disabilities or ageing populations might see a very positive role, some fantastic examples. Where would we never want to use robots? Where should they never be used? Well, I think this paediatrician from the US at the beginning of the year when these robots were appearing at CES was suggesting that we should outsource the emotional labour of childcare to robots. I think there is going to be a line there that we need to be very cautious of. Okay? Yep. And if we go, if any of you have heard of studies about depriving monkeys of maternal care early on, Harlow's monkey was a tragic period of psychological research where monkeys were deprived and given a choice of just an iron sort of basic wire monkey or the same but covered in cloth. There were very important differences there, even for that deprivation. Those that just had the wire mother sort of had indigestion, trouble digesting their food, and had diarrhea. Really physical aspects of their health were affected by the quality of care. And I suspect we've got some way to go before emotional learning is by machines in terms of responding and empathising with an infant, which is of course a challenge for many parents too. It's really core, and it's not something to get wrong. And just not too distressing. That is not a monkey who's having a good experience of life. So, and this is the one with the cloth-bound mother. So I think I'll leave you with that. That if, one of the things we do for each other is help bear distress, and that might be one of the core tasks to keep in mind for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. If she wasn't still alive, I'd make some sarcastic remarks about my own mother now, but she is, so I'll avoid that. Half-wire wire.
We can do a consultation.
Our next speaker is Professor Guangzhong Yang. I was lucky enough to travel with him recently to Taiwan, where we saw some of the quite amazing investments into technology for healthcare, large corporations in Taiwan are putting forward. And hopefully he can give us some allusions to the fairly impressive, very impressive work Islabs are doing, bringing robots into healthcare in the UK. Yeah.
Great. If I can get the screen to come up. So I'll let you to figure this out. So I suppose to finish in 2 minutes, that 8:35. I was going to actually talk about medical robotics, but I thought perhaps it's more appropriate actually to use the rest of the time is actually to raise a few questions that following from the previous speakers in terms of what we have discussed so far. And of course that medical robotics has advanced tremendously in the last 25 years. It was a niche, now it's really entering into the normal operating theater. But here is that the most important thing is that how this actually will change our practice and how this will actually influence we practice medicine. So how many people want an autonomous robot operating on the patient, or you would rather actually have the surgeon to operate on the patient? And how would you like this to be that fully autonomous or human synergistic control? So these are all the things that we need to discuss. So I'm also the editor for Science Robotics. I think today's topic is really relevant. Perhaps that I would like to use this actually to highlight some of the issues not only in medical robotics, which I'm not going to spend the rest of the time. In fact, that the debate actually will be more interesting. So perhaps that to highlight some of the things we academics need to address, and also the community to need to work together. Questions are later on for our discussion is how this robotics will change the job structure. Are these scaremongering issues that robots are going to take over our life, our world, our jobs, and also that everything from us, or actually that we are far from it. Complacency that the robot is too far away, it's not going to change our life, perhaps this is not realistic. So we formed this UK robotics network, and really covering from deep sea exploration to space, to AI, to medical, to transport, manufacturing, and really to bring all these things together. Number one is to bring a coherent vision in terms of UK robotics. And number two is to make sure we have a systematic way of preparing our next generation, the researchers and also younger generation, in terms of the robotic revolution or transformation, if you like. And so there is really that to outline some of the strengths we have. And this is actually supported by UK's research council called Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And what we try to do is to really every year to bring the robotics activities that in the last week of June is really to autonomous vehicles, driving, transport, and also infrastructure maintenance, and all these issues, and how this will influence the job structure. And today's topic talk about empathy and also the design, the machine that be able to understand, design the machine that actually can interact with the human, and all these things are clearly relevant topics that we try to address. Perhaps for the audience, that for the discussion later on, what I would like to know is that to go along this route, that in terms of some of the discussion we had, and what kind of synergy we need to create, and also what type of human-robot interaction that we would like to see, and what are the specific challenges that the UK actually can address. So this is something set the scene for the next June, last week of June, and really that we are going to address 4 major challenges that in fact during that week is really in terms of robots for home care, and robots for surgery, robots for extreme environments, and robots for rescue. So all these are relevant topics, and all these are perhaps can put the robot to good use. So now I'm right on time, that then 8:35 I'm supposed to finish. Then we can spend more time on the debate, and Rich, I will deliver a medical robotics talk for our next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can just invite all our panelists to come back up onto the stage and take a seat. And I have a list of questions that have turned up from Twitter. I'm going to exercise my chairman's privilege and ask exactly the wrong person each question. Actually, I'm going to throw the question out and let you pick who answers it, because the first question I think is in almost no one's domain. To what extent could this idea of robot avatars oppose the current ideas of sending humans to Mars?
Well, I actually have a theory that the whole autonomous cars program is really about Mars anyway. So what you want is you want corporations who want to have an exit plan basically when they destroy the Earth, and they're not going to take people with them, so they want to take sex robots and autonomous cars. No, I'm serious. I mean, this is a really this is what I really think is going on. And I think one good thing corporations are good at is not spending their own money. So getting organisations like the European Union on board or the British government is really great for them, because then they can get the best minds to work on problems for the end of humanity. That's my thoughts. Sorry.
So the use of remote presence and being able to access spaces which you couldn't get to very easily is actually quite an interesting aspect in our domain of assisted living. One of the things we've learned from talking to carers is that when they have to go out for consultations to people's homes, the waiting list is tremendous because there are very few specialists available. And so one of the things that we're exploring is the use of telepresence robots, whereby you could have the expert in a person's home much quicker, being able to do an assessment, move around the home independently, rather than saying you have to wait 3 weeks or 4 weeks before somebody can come and see you. So one of the things that excites me is by the development that's taking place by the corporations for their own specific interests will have a knock-on benefit for us down here on Earth.
That's very optimistic.
Well, I was just thinking, I don't know whether I trust a robot to do that. There's something about having that lived experience that is exploratory work of that nature. Default to that. But,
The classic experience of VR is put headset on, stand up, take half a step, fall over face first. I think I can get a robot to replicate that very, very reliably. I've done many times. So let's move on to the second question. How can we ensure human well-being in a world of robots?
Well, perhaps I can just start that I think ensure human being, the well-being of a human being, that it really depends on what is your really the definition. I think the use of robots, according to the Asimov's law, that from the very beginning is really to enhance our ability, enhance our experience, and also that the physical capabilities in terms of this. I think in today's previous talk's discussion, using robots for assistive technologies, I think I really like you pay attention to this word dignity. I think for the care and also that for remote presence and all those things, the dignity is really one of the area that I think there's a lot of potential for us to explore. And we perhaps that when I get older, perhaps I do mind that to be cared by a stranger, but maybe that I will be more receptive to be assisted by a robot. So that will be the kind of thing that we can explore.
I was noticing very much in the question even that there is a real mistrust of robots in a way, that even the question about how can we ensure the well-being of humans or human beings in a world of robots would imply an idea that somehow robots are going to interfere with the well-being of human beings. When in fact a lot of the ideas that have been presented today are very much about some of the ways in which human beings can make mistakes, human beings can be fallible, and can cause a lot of sort of difficulty for other human beings. And actually, some of the ways in which robots can be used can be very much about meeting the needs of human beings in ways that perhaps reduce some of that human error that is inherent in all our kind of abilities to think and feel, that are very influenced by difficult early experiences and that to some extent skew the objectivity of humans. So for me, in many respects, robots are very complementary to the well-being of human beings rather than cause effect.
I would say that robots need to convince humans that they will work for our own survival instead of their own survival.
That's actually a very, very useful way to distinguish between the two types. Personally, my view is you teach children to stay out the way of any firing line a robot could be at the far end of, but I grew up on Terminator, so I'm perhaps biased. My next question then, these are good questions, I think. Given the symbiotic theory of evolution, could robots be the partners needed for humans to evolve further? Nodding on that one?
No, I very much agree. I think often the tech makes us develop in a way that, whether it's in well-being terms or cognitively, I think there are huge opportunities. But I do think we need to understand that sort of emotional health as well, both in terms of how we develop in a good sense. But I don't see, I think if we get it right, yes.
And also, I think it is inevitable that, when we are, in fact, when everybody says that the robot will be our smart human, but they also forget that actually we adapt to the very instrument, tools, robots surrounding us. Actually, we change the way how we operate. For instance, if I ask the audience here, how many people can remember more than 10 telephone numbers? How many? Just raise your hand. How many people that can remember? You remember 10 telephone numbers 10 years ago? Probably most of us. It's just that the ability to use all the smartphones and make us that pay less attention, or perhaps less part of the brain remembering things, and we pay more attention or more skilled in terms of looking for information, organizing information, and summarizing information. So I think our ability in terms of reasoning and all this will change. And with the use of robots, perhaps that our interacting with the physical environment may adapt and may change as well.
Yes, I think that's a really interesting point about what we lose when we start to use different types of tools and what impact that will have on our creativity ourselves. So in terms of coming up with new objects, playing with hands and plasticine and discovering how things are shaped and what becomes something new is very basic to us as we develop as part of the development process. So there's some interesting work being done with children who are just using tablets to color and play, and what sort of impact that will have in the future in their ability to be able to conceive something tangible out of that experience. So yes, interesting things for us to think about is how our brain works and what we need for its development process.
Patrick, I've got a couple of linked questions for you. How are you defining an emotion, and how do you show that what you're demonstrating is an emotion rather than clever simulation of an emotion?
My purpose is not to say that the machine experiences emotion the way we do. The purpose is not to see the machine feel exactly the way we do. At the end, it's a machine. We synthesize emotions in a machine for the machine to be able to sense the world the way we do. An emotion for us at Emotion, we believe that emotion is everything about survival. Nothing more, nothing less. It's nothing related to sentiment. It plays a very important role in the sentiment and the affective computing, because on the affecting, the reproduction of humans is based on